Johnny Depp sat in his office on the top floor of a modern high-rise in downtown Los Angeles. The tall panoramic windows offered a view of the city skyline, endless streams of cars, bright billboard lights, and a light haze hanging over the city. The room was quiet, disturbed only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. On the dark oak desk, a glass of whiskey gleamed, and next to it lay a tablet with the latest financial reports. Johnny ran a tired hand through his hair and leaned toward the tablet, but his thoughts were far away. Business was thriving, but lately he had been feeling an inner emptiness. His company, Deep Air, was one of the most prestigious private aviation firms in the world. For over 10 years, he had built it from scratch, putting his taste and vision into every detail. His planes were a symbol of comfort and status for the wealthy across the globe, from Arab sheiks to Hollywood stars. But recently, he had started noticing small cracks in the perfect structure of his business. Complaints about service had become more frequent, and customer satisfaction levels had dropped. Regional managers assure him that everything was under control, but Johnny's instincts told him otherwise. He could feel that something was wrong. He decided to check everything personally. Not as the owner, not as a public figure, but as an ordinary passenger. He wanted to understand exactly what had gone wrong and experience the atmosphere of his airline from the inside. Johnny booked one of the company's domestic flights from Los Angeles to New York. His assistant arranged the booking, but no one on board was supposed to know who he really was. He planned to blend in, without his usual elegant suits and sunglasses. A few hours later, he was already standing in a spacious private airport hangar. Johnny looked completely different, a black cap pulled low over his eyes, an old t-shirt, and worn jeans. He was almost unrecognizable. As he walked toward boarding, he took a deep breath of the fresh air. The smell of jet fuel and warm asphalt filled his lungs. The plane looked perfect, clean, with a gleaming white body. The Deep Air logo reflected the sunlight. The flight attendants in flawless uniforms greeted passengers with professional smiles. Johnny quietly climbed the stairs and found his seat in business class, a wide leather seat with a panoramic window. As soon as he sat down, the plane began to fill with passengers. A couple in business suits sat down next to him, energetically discussing some deal. Johnny settled into his seat, trying to blend into the environment. A few minutes later, a flight attendant approached him, a young woman with short dark hair and a serious expression. Her name tag read Emma. She looked exhausted, but maintained a professional posture. "Excuse me, sir, but this seat is reserved for business class passengers," she said in a restrained voice. Johnny raised his eyes in surprise. "Yes, I know. This is my seat." Emma frowned. "Sorry, but there may have been a mistake. You're probably supposed to be in economy class. If you'd like, I can help you find your seat." Johnny hesitated for a moment. She clearly didn't recognize him, which was intriguing. "I think everything is fine," he replied calmly. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move. This seat is reserved for business clients." Her voice took on a sharper tone of impatience. Johnny felt a wave of irritation rise within him, but he held back from responding harshly. He was curious to see how far this would go. "Are you sure I'm not a business client?" he asked softly, tilting his head slightly. "Your appearance." She trailed off, realizing she had said too much. "I'm just trying to follow the rules," she added coolly. Johnny remained calm. "I understand. Then maybe you should check my booking." Emma gave him a suspicious look, then nodded and pulled out her tablet. Johnny watched as her expression changed when she saw his name on the list. Her eyes widened in shock as she quickly looked up. "You, Mr. Depp." Johnny smiled faintly. "Yes, and it seems this really is my seat." Emma blushed, her eyes widening in disbelief. She opened her mouth to say something, but instead stepped back. I'm so sorry," she stammered, but Johnny stopped her with a small gesture. "It's fine," he said softly. "It's hard to do your job when the rules matter more than the people, right?" She didn't answer, only gave a small nod. Johnny leaned closer. "Tell me, Emma, how long have you been working here?" She sighed. "Almost 2 years." "And how do you like the job?" She looked at him with tired eyes. "I'm just trying to do everything right." Johnny nodded. His suspicions were starting to confirm themselves. Something was broken within the system, and he intended to fix it. But first, he wanted to understand how deep the problem went. Johnny settled into his seat, watching as other passengers took their places. The plane was slowly filling with people, business suits, expensive watches, smartphones in hand. Everyone looked busy and focused on their own affairs. The atmosphere was tense, but that was normal for business class flights. Emma returned a few minutes later with a tray holding a glass of champagne. She carefully placed it on the small table in front of Johnny and said in a quiet voice, "Sorry for the misunderstanding, Mr. Depp." Johnny smiled faintly. "It's nothing. You had good instincts." Emma gave a tense nod and was about to walk away when Johnny quietly asked, "Why did you think I was sitting in the wrong seat?" She hesitated for a moment, as if considering her answer. "We often see passengers trying to sneak into business class without the right ticket. I just wanted to avoid any problems." "Does that happen often?" Johnny asked. Emma nodded. "Lately, yes. But it's not just that. Passengers have become more nervous, more prone to complaining. Flights are delayed, luggage gets lost. Sometimes we receive strange orders from management to ignore minor violations or complaints unless they're too serious." Johnny listened carefully. This confirmed his suspicions. Somewhere at the top level of the company, poor decisions were being made, and it was already starting to affect the reputation of Deep Air. "And how do you handle it?" he asked. Emma shrugged. "We try to do our jobs, but sometimes it feels like passengers are angry not because of the service, but because of the overall atmosphere. It's hard to explain. Like something has changed, but we don't know exactly what." Johnny thought for a moment. His company had always prided itself on impeccable service, attentive staff, comfort, and privacy for premium clients. But if even the flight attendants were sensing the tension, the problem ran deeper than he had imagined. The loud sound of the airplane doors closing brought him back to reality. "Welcome aboard Flight DL 452 from Los Angeles to New York." The captain's voice came over the speakers. "Estimated flight time, 5 hours and 30 minutes. Please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Johnny leaned back in his seat, listening to the standard safety instructions. The plane began to slowly taxi toward the runway. Johnny felt a familiar light pressure in his stomach as the engines roared at full power and the plane began to accelerate. Within seconds, the nose lifted, and the plane smoothly left the ground. A minute later, the plane was already flying steadily above the clouds. Flight attendants began serving drinks and snacks. Johnny noticed Emma glancing at him from the corner of her eye. She was still nervous after the earlier incident. "Relax, Emma," he said softly. "I'm not here to test you." She nodded, but the tension in her eyes remained. Johnny picked up his tablet and began reviewing reports. They confirmed what he had already suspected: an increase in customer complaints, more frequent delays, and logistical issues. But that wasn't all. The reports had strange gaps. Some expenses seemed inflated, and the maintenance reports looked too perfect to be true. Someone is hiding the real situation. Johnny set the tablet aside and took a sip of champagne. He was already beginning to form a plan to uncover the truth when he suddenly noticed something strange. A man in a black coat entered the business class cabin after takeoff. Johnny knew that was against the rules. After takeoff, passengers from economy class weren't allowed into business class without crew permission. But this man walked past the flight attendant with confidence, and she didn't even try to stop him. The man sat down 2 rows away from Johnny and calmly pulled a phone from his inner pocket. No emotion on his face, just a cold, focused gaze. Johnny felt a small prick of anxiety. He knew all the security protocols on his flights and knew the crew was supposed to check every passenger carefully. So why was this man here without any resistance? Johnny subtly glanced toward Emma. She had noticed the man too and gave him a wary look. But instead of approaching to check his seat, she stepped back and pretended nothing had happened. Johnny turned his head toward the man in the coat. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and the man smiled faintly. There was something wrong about that smile. The man slowly lifted his phone to his ear and said quietly, "We're in the air. It's starting." Johnny felt a chill run through him. What exactly is starting? Johnny took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. His fingers involuntarily tightened around the champagne glass. The man in the black coat remained seated calmly, but there was a cold confidence about him that made Johnny's heart beat faster. Johnny discreetly pressed the flight attendant call button. Emma appeared within seconds, maintaining a professional smile. "How can I help you?" she asked softly. Johnny leaned closer and whispered, "Who is that man?" Emma cast a quick glance at the man in the coat before replying. "He wasn't on the business class passenger list. But I was told not to interfere." "Who told you that?" Johnny's voice sharpened. Emma looked at him uneasily. "The captain. He contacted me through the intercom right after takeoff and ordered me to allow that passenger to stay in business class." Johnny hesitated for a moment. This was very strange. The captain never got involved in such situations. That was the crew's responsibility. And why had the man in the coat boarded after takeoff? Johnny pulled out his phone and opened the internal security system. As the owner of the company, he had access to all the cameras on board. But when he opened the cabin camera feed, all he saw was a black screen. "What the hell?" he muttered. "Is everything all right?" Emma asked, noticing his tense expression. Johnny opened another camera, same result. No signal. He checked the cameras in the cargo hold and the cockpit. Every feed showed the same black screen. "Are we having security system issues?" he asked Emma. She looked confused. "I haven't been informed of any problems." Johnny glanced at the man in the coat. He was still holding a phone to his ear, but now his eyes were focused directly on Johnny. The smile on his face widened. "We're in the air. It's starting." Johnny felt a cold sweat run down his back. He stood up quickly and headed toward the cockpit. Emma followed behind him. "You can't go in there," she said, trying to stop him. "I own this plane," Johnny snapped. "I can go wherever I want." He approached the cockpit door and entered the access code. The door remained locked. That was impossible. He had full control over all security systems on board. "Open the door," he said into the intercom. No response. "Open it now." Johnny's voice grew more tense. He entered the emergency security code, but the door wouldn't budge. "What's happening?" Emma asked nervously. "I'd like to know that myself," Johnny hissed. Suddenly, the captain's voice came through the speakers. "Mr. Depp, please return to your seat." "Open the door," Johnny repeated. "It's for your safety, Mr. Depp," the captain replied calmly. Johnny felt anger boiling inside him. He turned to look at the man in the coat. He was now standing in the aisle, holding the phone in his hand, staring directly at Johnny. "What the hell is going on?" Johnny took a step forward. The man in the coat slowly raised his hand and said, "We've just taken control of this plane." Johnny felt his breath catch. "What did you say?" The man smiled. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Depp. From now on, we're flying a new route." Johnny lunged toward him, but the man raised his hand, and 2 other men stood up from nearby seats. They were dressed in black, their faces blank. One of them had a hand in his pocket. Johnny immediately realized there was a weapon. "Sit down, Mr. Depp," the man in the coat said coldly. Johnny stepped back, clenching his fists. "What do you want?" The man approached him, leaned closer, and whispered, "Your business and your life. And if you want to keep both, I suggest you sit down and listen." Johnny's jaw tightened, his heart pounding. He glanced at Emma. She looked scared, but was trying to keep her composure. The man in the coat took a step back. "We don't have much time, Mr. Depp. You either play by our rules, or this flight will be your last." Johnny slowly sat down. His mind raced, searching for a way out. This was his plane, his company, his rules. But now he was trapped, and someone else held all the cards. Johnny took a slow breath, trying to calm himself. He looked around. The passengers in business class were sitting silently, but many of them looked tense. They sensed something was wrong, but they hadn't yet grasped the full scale of the danger. The man in the coat stood in the middle of the aisle, watching Johnny intently. Two guards remained in place, one of them pulling a small device from his pocket that resembled a signal jammer. Johnny realized that was the reason the cameras had stopped working. "What do you want?" Johnny asked coldly. The man in the coat sat down in the adjacent seat and casually crossed his legs. "You have a company with a fleet of private jets," he began. "That's a big business, Johnny. Your company transports hundreds of wealthy people every day. Politicians, businessmen, celebrities. People who can be ransomed." Johnny clenched his fists. "You want to hijack the plane and demand a ransom?" The man smiled. "That would be too simple. No, we're playing a bigger game. We want your company, the whole business. You'll hand over control and we'll ensure your safety. If you refuse, this plane will never land." Johnny looked at him coldly. "You're bluffing." The man in the coat leaned closer. His dark eyes seemed to look straight into Johnny's soul. "We're already in the air, Mr. Depp. We already control the cockpit. Now decide, do you want to land, or do you want to become the headline of the day?" Johnny felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "If I agree, how can I be sure you'll release all the passengers?" "You don't have a choice," the man replied. "Now, call your lawyer and tell him to prepare the ownership transfer papers." Johnny stood up abruptly. "And how am I supposed to do that? My phone doesn't work, the cameras are off, and the ground connection is cut." The man in the coat calmly raised his hand, and one of the guards handed him a satellite phone. "Here, Mr. Depp. Call." Johnny took a deep breath. His mind was racing, desperately searching for a way out. He took the phone and started dialing his lawyer's number. But as the phone rang, he noticed a detail that gave him hope. On the satellite phone screen, a small icon flashed, an open connection. Johnny realized the phone was connected to an open frequency. That meant the signal could be intercepted, and someone on the ground might be able to pick it up. "Hello, Henry, it's me, Johnny," he said into the receiver when the lawyer answered. "We've got a problem. The plane has been delayed due to a malfunction." Johnny deliberately paused. "We're on board my business jet, New York to London route. You understand what I mean?" "A delay due to a malfunction?" Henry paused for a moment. "Johnny, are you all right?" "Yes, but we need help with security. It concerns the company." Johnny deliberately emphasized the word security. "I understand," Henry replied. "I'll immediately contact the appropriate people." Johnny slowly hung up the phone. "I did as you asked," he said, looking at the man in the coat. "Smart choice, Mr. Depp," the man smiled. "Now sit down and enjoy the flight." Johnny slowly lowered himself into the seat, but inside, he felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His lawyer understood the cue, and now the security services knew the plane was in danger. The question was how long it would take for them to react, and whether Johnny could by that time. He looked again at the man in the coat. The man was sitting calmly, his arms crossed over his chest. Johnny wasn't planning to give up without a fight. He glanced at the emergency exit overhead. He was already formulating a plan in his head. And this time, the game would be played by his rules. Johnny carefully glanced around, trying not to draw too much attention. The guards stood on either side of the cockpit, but their positions had weak spots. If he could distract them just right. The man in the cloak noticed his gaze and barely smiled. "Don't even try, Mr. Depp. You're not on your turf." Johnny calmly looked back at him. "I've worked in this field my whole life. Believe me, I know this game better than you." The man in the cloak tilted his head as if contemplating his response, but at that moment, a dull click echoed in the cabin. "What was that?" one of the guards snapped. Johnny peered into the aisle. A young steward, around 25, was standing near the back door of the plane. He nervously rubbed his hands together. "Sorry, I think there's an issue with the seal. I heard the pressure sensor go off." The man in the cloak scrutinized him. "Sit down." The steward nodded and walked back to his seat. But as he turned, Johnny noticed a small black device in his hand, a distress beacon. The steward had activated it. Johnny felt a surge of hope. Someone on the ground must already know about the hijacking. "Your team works fast," Johnny said again, trying to distract the man. "But I'm curious, how are you planning to get out of this? Let's say I sign the documents. The plane still has to land. And then what?" The man in the cloak smiled. "We've already thought of that. After the transfer of rights, we'll land the plane in a neutral zone. The passengers will stay safe. We will too. And if I refuse?" The man in the cloak shrugged. "Then we'll try another method of persuasion. For example," he glanced toward the stewardess standing by the emergency exit. "A little incident on board always makes people make decisions faster." Johnny felt a chill run down his spine. He had to act quickly. "All right," Johnny said. "I agree. Give me the documents." One of the guards stepped forward and pulled a folder of contracts from his briefcase. "Sign here." Johnny slowly took the pen. His eyes stayed locked on the man in the cloak, but from his peripheral vision, he saw movement. The steward, who had activated the beacon, was now standing by the emergency exit. His hand touched the lever. Johnny understood the plan and played his part. "Sorry, but I always read the fine print," Johnny said and turned the page. "Are you kidding?" The man in the cloak frowned. "No, this is a serious contract," Johnny stalled. At that moment, the steward yanked the emergency exit lever. A loud click rang out, and an alarm blared throughout the cabin. A rush of air swept through the cabin, knocking people off their feet. One guard fell to the floor, while the other grabbed onto a seat. Johnny used the chaos. He struck the man in the cloak in the face, ripping the folder from his hands. The man staggered but quickly recovered, punching Johnny in the stomach. Johnny felt the wind knocked out of him, but he held his ground. He swung and elbowed the man in the jaw. He fell to the floor, losing his balance from the rush of air. One of the guards rushed at Johnny, but the steward managed to shoot him with a taser. The guard collapsed. "The plane," the steward yelled. "We've lost control of the pilots." Johnny stood up, clutching his ribs. "Then I'll take the controls." He sprinted toward the cockpit, stepping over the fallen guards. The cockpit door was locked from the inside. Johnny leaned into the intercom by the door and spoke into the microphone. "This is Johnny Depp. Open the door." There was no response. "Open the door or I'll break it down," Johnny shouted. "I don't think that will work," a voice behind him said. Johnny turned around. The man in the cloak was already standing, wiping blood from his lip. "We're not done yet, Mr. Depp." Johnny felt a rush of adrenaline. "Well then, let's finish this for real." He lunged forward. The man in the cloak drew a knife, but Johnny dodged and knocked him to the floor. They both fell, struggling for control of the knife. Johnny felt the blade slide across his arm, but he grabbed the attacker's wrist and slammed his head into the floor. The man in the cloak groaned and went silent. Johnny stood up, gasping for air. The steward ran up to him. "The cockpit is still locked." Johnny raised the knife and in a second jammed it into the lock of the cockpit door. A loud screeching sound filled the air and the door opened. Inside, the pilots were unconscious. Johnny sat at the controls. "Do you know how to fly this plane?" the steward shouted. "I own a company that operates private flights," Johnny replied, pressing the control levers. "You think I don't know how to fly?" The engines roared to life, and the plane began to descend. Johnny focused on approaching the runway. "Everyone, fasten your seatbelts," he said into the intercom. The ground was rapidly approaching. "If you land this plane," the steward began. "I'll land it," Johnny interrupted. "I'm not losing in my own game." He tilted the plane at the correct angle and began the descent. The runway lights appeared ahead. He was going to land this plane, and he was going to win. Johnny gripped the control yoke tightly, feeling each movement of the plane reverberate in his muscles. The runway was rapidly approaching. He adjusted the course, slowly pulled the throttle lever back, and deployed the landing gear. The plane trembled, but Johnny remained calm. "Hold on," shouted the steward. The runway lights shone brightly ahead of them. Johnny leveled the plane and focused on the speed. The plane touched the ground with a loud thud, but Johnny kept a firm grip on the yoke. The wheels screeched across the concrete, smoke rising from the friction of the rubber, but the plane stayed on course. "Almost," Johnny whispered. He pressed on the brakes. The plane rapidly slowed down until it finally came to a stop at the end of the runway. A tense silence filled the cabin, broken only by the heavy breathing of the passengers. Johnny leaned back in his seat, catching his breath. "Is everything okay?" You did it," the steward exclaimed, his voice trembling. Johnny stood up and left the cockpit. In the cabin, the passengers slowly got up, looking at him in surprise and relief. "That was incredible," said the stewardess, standing near the emergency exit. Johnny glanced at the man in the coat, who lay unconscious on the floor. The guards were also neutralized. "They won't hurt anyone anymore," Johnny said, straightening his jacket. Outside, flashing emergency lights illuminated the scene. The emergency exit opened, and armed security personnel in bulletproof vests boarded the plane. "Is everyone okay?" one of the agents asked. "Yes," Johnny replied, "but this guy will need handcuffs." The agents lifted the man in the coat. He was already conscious and glared at Johnny with hatred. "You lost," he hissed. Johnny stepped closer and coldly replied, "I always win." The agent led the criminal towards the exit. Johnny watched them go, then turned to the passengers. "Now we're all safe," he said, and headed towards the exit. As he stepped onto the stairs, the wind blew through his hair. Journalists' cameras were already waiting for him at the bottom. Johnny ignored them. He was tired but satisfied. The steward, the same one who helped during the crisis, approached him. "That was impressive, sir." Johnny smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "You did well, too. Without you, we wouldn't have made it." "Where are you going now?" the steward asked. Johnny adjusted his jacket, looked up at the sky, and smiled. "To the office. I still have an airline to manage." He calmly walked toward the airport exit, leaving the chaos of the night behind and proving once again that in his game, he always wins.